Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm reviewing Blood Meridian, or The Evening Redness in the West by Cormac McCarthy. And it's definitely one of the more challenging books I've ever read. Certainly the most violent book I've ever read in my life. And it's not simply the physical violence, but there's, in a sense, a violence that's done to you as the reader by having to process all the physical violence that's going on the pages. That said, I will say that unlike film or television violence, which is something that's going to imprint with you maybe till your dying day, the nice thing about book violence is that the author is outsourcing the imaging to you. So if it's something that you want to stay distant from, you're not going to build it out in your imagination. And I think many readers, certainly I would count myself in this number, someone who read the descriptions of violence in a more superficial way, that we understood what was going on the page, but we didn't try too hard to imagine it in detail. And it's also difficult to read, not just because of the violence, but because of the richness of literary allusions. McCarthy is well read, and he does not put that to waste. He deploys it in every aspect, and there's times when you get it, it's very clear. There are other times when you're sure you're missing something because it seems too crafted. But can I say that I enjoyed this? I think I enjoyed being challenged. I really enjoyed being challenged. And the book is deeply rewarding in its language and its prose, its descriptions of nature. I'll just give you an example of... I have this Vintage International edition, so the page numbers that I'll be citing are coming from this edition. So page 195, this is in the middle of what looks like a 12-line sentence. So the sentence goes on for 12 lines. This is just a clause from this. Racing in the stone arroyos, like the embreachment of some ultimate alchemic work decocted from out the secret dark of the earth's heart. And you read that phrase as a native English speaker, and you're just struck by the construction of it, the evocative nature of its construction. And you have to pause, not necessarily because you don't understand the words, because most of those words are fairly straightforward, but because you're trying to reconstruct what he's telling you, and it's astonishing. Then there are other scenes which are arresting in their imagery. This one is from page 215, and I wouldn't even call him a protagonist. There are plenty of other videos on YouTube about Blood Meridian that do an excellent job of not just going over the plot, but also giving you historical perspective. I'm not going to pretend to give anything like that. This, as always with my book reviews, is more about my impressions about things that are in the book and things that I think are relevant for you as a reader to consider. But at this point, our so-called protagonist of the novel has been wandering through a very cold night, and he sees a lone tree burning on the desert. Again, this is on page 215. It was a lone tree burning on the desert, a heraldic tree that the passing storm had left afire. The solitary pilgrim drawn up before it had traveled far to be here, and he knelt in the hot sand and held his numbed hands out, while all about in that circle attended companies of lesser auxiliaries, routed forth into the inordinate day, small owls that crouched silently and stood from foot to foot, and tarantulas, and sulpugas, and vinegaroons, and the vicious mygale spiders, and beaded lizards with mouths black as a chow dog's, deadly to man, and the little desert basilisks that jet blood from their eyes, and the small sand vipers like seemly gods, silent and the same, in Jeddah, in Babylon. A constellation of ignited eyes that edged the ring of light, all bound in a precarious truce before this torch whose brightness had set back the stars in their sockets. I mean, It's just astonishing. So there's multiple things going on here. Firstly, we have a allusion to the burning bush. So the burning bush is where Moses encountered God up on the mountain, and that was a solitary moment. Here, instead, this is burning the desert, and the young man has his hands out to warm it, but also this could be construed as a position of prayer in front of this tree, and you have all of these decidedly evil things being brought out. But again, this is an evocative of other scriptural references when it says the lion will lay down with the lamb, that all of these creatures can be gathered around God and be at peace. And here we're being told the bearded lizards with mouths black as a chow dog's deadly to man, and they're right next to a man. And there is this moment of peace. Why? Because of this burning tree. And what does this burning tree represent? Well, I couldn't begin to tell you one meaning, because there's several layers of meaning, especially where we are at this point in the narrative. We're more than 2/3 of the way through the book. So there's a lot there. And those are, I've read to you part of a very long sentence and this beautiful scene, but there's also just little moments in which you could have an entire short story written about. So this is from page 63, and they're out in the desert, and the protagonist spits. The kid spat dryly and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. A lizard came out from under a rock and crouched on its small cocked elbows over that piece of froth, and drank it dry, and returned to the rock again, leaving only a faint spot in the sand, which vanished almost instantly. The desert's dangerous even for its native inhabitants. So a lizard knows to come out, get its water, and then go back. Humans have no business living in the desert. And what drags them out there is money. For example, Phoenix is one of the cities that would grow out from the area that is covered in this novel. But to this day, Phoenix is a city that should not exist. It's not near a river. It only exists because it takes a large amount of water from the Colorado River. So much water, in fact, that sometimes the river doesn't flow all the way to the sea as it used to. And there's a further reflection on what are humans doing out in the desert. They're not seeking God, they're seeking money, which they've made into a god. And they don't have the common sense to realize that the animals and the inhabitants around them, they only survive by getting their bare necessities and leaving. And instead of having the common sense to say we as humans don't belong here in the desert, we continue to create our own fake realities that allow us to pretend that we can live in the desert when we really can't. You could have had a whole short story about that lizard and about living where you're not supposed to, by understanding how the native creatures have adapted. Here's another one. This is on page 112. It's just a sentence. One of the villains has cut open a dispatch box. He's looking for money, other things. Letters penned for any destination save here began to skitter and drift away down the canyon. Each of those letters representing maybe your father has died, I love you and I'd like to marry you, you've gotten the job, whatever it might be, those were never allowed to reach their destination. And the people on either end will never know what happened, and maybe their lives changed dramatically because this one person was seeking money, and as a result, he arbitrarily changed their lives. And the sadness of letters lost, scattered in a canyon unknown somewhere. It's, again, a short story within a sentence, and that's part of the beauty and the wonder of McCarthy's writing. And the only McCarthy book I'd read prior to this was The Road, and it's not anywhere near as violent as this. It is bleak, certainly, but you can tell that they were written by the same author, but obviously in different times and in different genres. This is Blood Meridian is very much a historical novel, so it's built around there was a real life Glanton gang, and this attempts to speak about that. There were real troubles between Mexicans, Indians, and Americans during this time period before and after the Mexican-American War. This attempts to talk about some of that, but it's not like any other historical novel that I've read. It's because it's doing its own thing. It's not simply trying to use a historical event or a series of events to give you a frame. It's built its own frames, and it's built its own genre in a certain sense. It's often called an anti-Western, but I just feel that doesn't do it enough justice to simply set it up as anti another genre. It's in its own class. The last question, which I think is worth dealing with, is do you need to see, read, witness violence in order to better understand it? Yes and no. I mean, obviously, someone who has grown up with violence in their lives, in his or her life, is going to have a better understanding of what violence is. You simply can't tell me that some sheltered suburban child who's read about violence understands violence in the same way that a kid raised in a difficult and dangerous neighborhood understands violence. So there's obviously an argument to be made for experiencing and witnessing violence as giving you deeper perspectives. Now, the question that follows on from that is, so do I need to go move to a dangerous neighborhood in order to understand violence? No. Do I need to read about violence in order? There's no obligation, obviously, to read or to study these things. But I do think there is a value in looking violence in the face, looking at evil in the face, because ultimately what McCarthy is getting at is, we may like to distance ourselves like, oh, well, I would never murder women and children. I would never commit these atrocities. But evil and sin lies deep down in all of us. And we're just on a different end of the spectrum. But we're still on the spectrum. And I think that's one of the great successes of Blood Meridian, is reminding all of the readers, you're not above violence. You're not above evil. You're part of the human race, and we're all indicted in evil, and that's something worth considering deeply and even violently. If you enjoyed this review, please give it a thumbs up. That's something that the algorithm really likes. And consider subscribing if you'd like to see other book reviews. I do an exclusive review for my patrons. This was a review that was only done for my patrons exclusively, and now it's available to you. And until next time, keep reading.